Today I've got Sarah McCammon with me. Sarah, you do a million things in the world. I don't even know all of the things, but one of those things is you work for NPR. You're a national political correspondent for NPR. Yes, that NPR, not the. I don't know how many other NPRs there are in the world, but it is the NPR that you might be thinking of. You work for that NPR.
Sometimes people ask me what I do, and I say I work for NPR, and they think I said I'm in PR, like public
Oh
relations. Not correct.
no, no,
But
the
yes, I
the
work for
the
National Public Radio, NPR.
Yeah, you are in millions of Prius owners' ears every single day.
I have no doubt.
So that NPR. Well, you also recently released a book called "The Exvangelicals: Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church," and so super excited to chat more about the book. But before we get into all of that, who is Sarah McCammon to Sarah McCammon?
Who is Sarah McCammon to Sarah McCammon? Oh, I'm a person. I'm a person who I guess has spent a lot of my life trying to understand the world. I think that's probably
Mm,
the shortest version of who I am. And that means through, the people around me. And really the reason I wrote the book is because the people around me growing up had a lot of different understandings of the world. And I think
mm,
the rest of my life has been about trying to make sense of that,
mm,
and continuing to incorporate and understand new people as I meet them. I think
mm,
sometimes something I'm fascinated by, both personally and professionally, is just the many, many, many ways of being human that there are. And
mm.
the many different ways that people see the world, the many different experiences they have. We only get to kind of have our one experience. And that's one of the things about journalism that I really love, is it gives me a lens into other people's experience and hopefully helps me understand my own a little bit better.
Mhm.
I guess the other things I'll say beyond that, I know women, it's a complicated relationship between defining yourself as this, but I am a wife and a mother, and
Mm.
I'm really proud of being particularly a mother. I have two teenage boys who I love very much, and I'm very grateful to have them in my life. And I'm one of those people that if they're waffling about having kids, I'm like, do it. Don't do it if you don't want to. But if you're like, I'm like, do it.
Well, let's talk about exvangelicals. Let's hear just kind of before we dive into your personal story in this. I'd love to hear just kind of like the history of exvangelicals. Like, obviously, this is like a sort of really at this point you could call it really a movement. Like, how did this start? Who are these people that we call exvangelicals?
Yeah, well, as far as I can tell, this was, a hashtag coined by Blake Chastain, who
Hmm.
I'm sure you're aware of, has a podcast called Exvangelical and does a lot of writing on this theme around 2015, 16. Um, and Blake was kind of publicly talking about some of these themes of what it's like to leave an evangelical community and some of the reasons for it. And those conversations were obviously catalyzed by the sort of political moment, that evangelicalism was experiencing surrounding its association with then candidate Donald Trump. So, I talked to Blake and others for this book who were part of kind of that early movement of using the exvangelical hashtag on Twitter, which spread to other social media sites, and there's a Facebook group. And what fascinated me about that is I'd actually heard the word for the first time, while doing a story for NPR about the Access Hollywood video, and I was writing about how some evangelical women like Beth Moore and others were really publicly grappling with what it meant for this movement that had been so critical of Bill Clinton's moral failings in the 90s and had, talked so much about the importance of character in our leaders, to now be aligned with Donald Trump and even continuing to defend him for the most part after the release of that video in which, he famously talked about grabbing women. Uh, I don't know what words we can say on this podcast, but
You can
by the
say whatever
pussy.
word you want.
We all know what he said, though. Anyway, so I first heard that word in the course of reporting out that story. Nicole Nordeman, who's a Christian singer, we talked to her for the story, and she said some of us are using this word exvangelical because evangelical just doesn't mean what it used to mean, or it's become so associated with this. And I started paying attention to that and kind of looking for this word and this hashtag, and I came across Blake's work, and I came across the work of people like Chrissy Stroop and others, Emily Joy Allison, who were writing about, leaving churches in part in response to Trumpism and sort of the increasing, extremism in some parts of the Christian right. And then I came across people like Jamar Tisby and other Black Christians who had this sort of related idea of leave loud, leaving your church and talking about why. These were Black Christians that were in white evangelical spaces who were also concerned about Trumpism, seeing many of their co-congregants voting for things that they felt were very contrary to their best interests. And also, of course, the response to the killing of George Floyd, things like that. So I was seeing, over the last several years since the Trump campaign, since I covered the Trump campaign, really, just seeing increasing, growing conversations around these themes. And of course, having my own evangelical background, I resonated with a lot of these conversations because they weren't just about the current moment. They weren't just about Trump by any stretch of the means, as you know. Exvangelicals are talking about a whole host of things that have, for whatever reason, forced them to rethink their evangelical background, sort of reckon with what the evangelical subculture had taught them, how it had formed them, what made sense for them, what didn't. Some of it was about values and character, and some of it was about truth and reality. And so the book, I kind of, organized it around these different themes that I was seeing people talk about, and also that I had my own experiences with. And so I think, the very short definition of exvangelical is somebody who used to be an evangelical, but isn't now for whatever reason. And people land in a whole lot of different places. Very often that means they're still Christian in some other way, but also very often it means that they no longer identify with a religious tradition. But I think the unifying thing is this experience of being part of this really robust subculture that you kind of don't even realize you're in until you're out of it, how much it shapes you. And having this usually kind of painful experience of leaving it intentionally or out of necessity.
Yeah. That leaving of it often is described using the word deconstruction. So, do you want to share maybe a little
Right.
bit about maybe what you got the sense of when you're interviewing people for this book? Like, what generally does deconstruction look like? Maybe there's a way you would define it, but I'm just curious, like thoughts on around this word deconstruction, especially as it relates to people who identify as ex-evangelicals.
Yeah. I mean, I think it comes from like the writings of Jacques Derrida, the literary critic and philosopher. And I think there's a loose relationship to that, to his ideas. But, functionally what it means in online spaces and in other spaces where people are talking about deconstruction is really kind of an unpacking, a rethinking, a re-examining, first realizing that the ideas that you've been presented with have been constructed in some way, which isn't to say that that is good or bad. It's just a reality, right? Everything from what you're taught about sexuality to theology to salvation to the history of the church, all of that, sometimes very often science, has been constructed in a certain way. There were people before you who built a set of ideas and then passed them on to you. And I think when people start struggling with some of these things, they often start questioning and going, okay, well, how do we know, how do we know that the Bible should be viewed in the way that we're told it should be viewed? How do we know, where did it come from? Who wrote it? What does it mean? What's the proper view of it? What's the proper role of it? And, this is something that in many ways Christians and other religious people have been doing forever, right? So like the Protestant Reformation was very much the same, and I'm not the first person to argue this, but I think this is a good argument. Protestant Reformation was a very similar process. It was about going, wait, the church is teaching us all these things, but are they all true? Do they all hold? Some of them don't seem to hold water, and creating a new set of ideas. It's sort of an evolution. And, for some people it does mean, simply leaving faith. But I think for a lot of people, it's much more complicated than that. And, for me, it involved, and I think for a lot of others, it involves some of the things I was just describing, like historical study, understanding, we place as Protestants and certainly as evangelicals, we place so much emphasis on scripture. Well, what is scripture? Who wrote it? How did it come to be seen as what it is? And when you understand some of that history, how much fighting there was, in the early centuries of the church and even later about what even should be seen as scripture. And that's in some ways, a debate that goes back to Judaism as well. I mean, the Jewish scriptures have fed into our scriptures, and so the more you understand about that, it doesn't necessarily determine what you think about a particular theological issue, but I think it does inform sort of your stance towards scripture and the way that you might incorporate it into your own thinking. And then for me, some of it was just simply taking in new information about the world, right? I'd been told a central figure in my book is my grandfather, my gay grandfather, who came out, after my grandmother passed away. And he was, someone we were trying to convert and change and make him be different than what he was, make him be more like us, because my parents believed that that was essential for him to be saved, for him to go to heaven. And, I accepted that for quite a while in my childhood, but I think the more I got to know him and the more I got to know other people who didn't share my beliefs, and the more I thought about it, the harder it became for me to believe that this view of humanity in the world was the one that seemed, right or just to me. So that kind of forced me to open up and rethink some things. I wanted to quite simply include him and know him and feel connected to a broader range of human experience than the people in my community. And so I think, it's a range of factors. And for some people, it's very intellectual. And for some people, it's more emotional. But I think there's a bit of both for most people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things that, as you're talking about this, that I didn't realize until after I had deconstructed and was an exvangelical, if you will, and certainly it sounds like this was your story as well, is how much of evangelicalism is predicated on its followers not questioning anything. Like, so much of it is predicated on no questioning at all. Like, you brought up, like, who wrote the Bible? How did the Bible come to be? Like, some of those questions that, you think are maybe basic questions to our faith. And, a tradition like evangelicalism really is sort of banking on its followers never asking those types of questions. It really is interesting how important that seems to be a foundation to a lot of evangelicalism, is that you should not be questioning anything.
Yeah, and I remember asking that question of a couple of authority figures when I was a teenager, and getting some version of the answer, that, well, we just trust God, that
Right.
God's hand was in it. And and I think one person said, well, Jesus said in the New Testament, of course, that every jot and tittle of the law will be fulfilled. And so that means that, God's law is fulfilled in the New Testament. And it was, that struck me as a pretty circular response, which again is not to diminish the value of the Bible. I draw so much wisdom from it, but this idea that every word is literally directly inspired by God, there's no error, which becomes really hard to hold on to if you do very much biblical criticism study at all,
Mm-hmm.
is really, that just that did not make sense to me the more I thought about it. And it was very exciting, conversely, to discover that there's a whole different approach in Judaism to scripture. There's a whole long history of debate. I think it's the Midrash that's rabbis over the centuries just arguing about what it means, and that's like preserved because it's valued. I'm not a scholar of Judaism, but that's my understanding, and I know that within Christianity there are various ways of looking at that, and people parse what the Bible is and what it means of all kinds of different ways. And so I am certainly not here to try to advocate one particular view, but I do think that when you approach it with a little bit more complexity and a little bit, when the overarching objective is not certainty and having this thing that you could definitely hang on to, which is really attractive, but I think for me ultimately unsustainable. And when the objective becomes instead, okay, what's real here? What can I learn from it? And for me, a lot of it has been an acceptance of the fact that there are just going to be things I don't know for sure. Whatever we know, we may or may not know from God is it comes from traditions in some sense, right? It's all either a tradition about what is the word of God, or a tradition, a literal religious tradition. These are all things that have been handed down to us. Like, I've never had to sit down with God. I've tried, I've prayed a lot and asked God for clarity about so many things. And there have been times I have felt, that, in some sense, God was working in my life, but it's never very specific. It's never very direct. It's certainly not like you and I are talking. And I don't think to be a person of faith or a good person, I have to pretend like it
Right.
is. And I realize there are people who say that they've had profound, unshakable, a profound religious experiences that they have unshakable confidence about, and that's great. I accept that, but I'm never going to overstate what I've experienced or what I know, and I think
Right.
that's what it kind of comes down to for me.
Yeah. One of the other things that has kind of like circling around in my head right now, as you're talking about kind of this like deconstruction process that happens for a lot of people, is, a lot of people will start having questions about maybe like theology. They start having questions or doubts about like the belief in hell or penal substitution theory of atonement or whatever. Or maybe it's, questions around church history. And so you have these
Right.
questions around that. Or people might start deconstructing because they have questions around like the culture that they have been sort of embedded in, like purity culture, or
Mhm.
only listening to certain kind of music or whatever it might be. Or then there's even like political questions that start coming up. It's like, why is it that every single one of my beliefs somehow aligns perfectly with the Republican Party? Like those kind of questions start coming up, and it seems like generally for most people that say that they've deconstructed, they go through a lot of those, if not most of those questions. They don't
Right.
just go through one.
Right.
And so it generally seems like when people say that they deconstruct, that is what's happening. It's not just somebody saying, you know what, I went from being a young Earth creationist to an old Earth creationist. It's not that's not just deconstruction. There seems to be something way more than that. And I think too, there's a sort of new deconstruction book that recently came out by Elisa Childers, and she talks about how like she's sort of deconstructed, but when you look at like what she sort of is at right now politically and theologically, you're kind of wondering, what did your beliefs change at all? And she'll kind of claim like, no, I really question a lot of these beliefs and I deconstructed or whatever, and it doesn't seem to be a very her story of what she claims to be deconstruction doesn't seem to be a very common story when we hear people say they deconstruct. So I'm curious, kind of like your thoughts around that, of like how people sort of use or adopt that term deconstruction, and what it seems to generally. It's again, for me, it seems like it generally seems that there's like a whole ton of questions that you decide, all right, I don't believe in hell anymore. I believe that homosexuality isn't a sin or whatever it might be. Whereas then there's other people like Alyssa or Elisa, that is like, no, 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 no. Like I deconstructed, but like you actually come out more conservative or something. So
Hmm.
anyway, curious like your thoughts around kind of some of that, especially as you talk to all these people that say they deconstructed and are evangelicals.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar. I'm aware of her book. I haven't read it, but I think I'm aware of the general perspective based on a couple of things I have read. But I'm not an expert on
Right.
everything she says. I think, but I'd also be kind of loath to define for someone else whether or not they've deconstructed,
Right.
or like what position you have to arrive at to have deconstructed. But I think like any term that becomes kind of a buzzword, and it really has,
Totally.
and we haven't even talked about the fact that it seems to be predominantly evangelical, exvangelical spaces. It's not limited to that. I mean, I see, ex-Mormons using this word, and I think even some
Hmm.
ex-Catholics and so forth. And so, um, it's become just a word that provides a language for something that a lot of people go through, and which also, let's face it, poses a threat to some powerful institutions. Like, I mean, it's not a great thing for pastors when people in their congregations deconstruct, because often they don't come back or they go somewhere
Right.
else. Um, and so I think for those reasons, I'm not that surprised that people would um, apply it in a different way, or seek to apply it in various ways. And I'm not impugning anyone's sincerity in using that term, but um, any time a word gets a little bit of cachet and seems to have some power, people have incentives to pick it up and use it and maybe reappropriate it in some ways, and that's fine. Um, but no, I think it. generally does involve a pretty deep, not just some tweaking of one's theology, but like a reframing of one's approach to epistemology. Like, I think that's
Mm,
really what it's about. Which is a big philosophy word, but like how we know things.
mhm,
Um, and I think a lot of it starts with somebody going, well, how do I know this is true? And then you
mhm,
have to rethink how you know what's true. And then that begins kind of a bigger journey. Which I think people arrive at different places, but I think you're right that there are some very similar and common experiences within that
mhm,
journey.
mhm. One of the things that has been really interesting as somebody who deconstructed, if you will, before 2016, before Trump, and before certainly this term exvangelical was coined, is so I started deconstructing in 2013 when I first went to college, and I went to a conservative Christian college, but that's when I started deconstructing, and I started reading people like Brian McLaren, Rachel Held Evans, Nadia Bolz-Weber, a lot of people who are kind of well known in the progressive Christian world, right?
Mhm.
And at that time, a lot of that, the sort of movement, if you will, it was not called exvangelical because, again, obviously that term hadn't been coined yet. But at that time, it seemed like a lot of people used the terminology of emergent. And so there
Right.
was like the whole emergent church movement. And certainly by 2013, it was sort of maybe getting towards the end of people using that terminology. But that's when I entered into quote unquote deconstruction. And we didn't even
Mhm.
call it deconstruction then. I just was like, oh, my beliefs are changing. Like there
Mhm.
wasn't a word for it. You just, that's what was happening. But yeah, emergent was like a really big thing at that time. I'm really curious, like, as you have, sort of learned about the stories of so many others, and especially I would imagine a lot of people who maybe deconstructed 2016 or post 2016. But I'm sure you're very well aware to a certain degree of the emergent church movement. But it does seem
Mhm.
like really much like a predecessor to what we now call like exvangelicalism or whatever. And so I'm just curious kind of like what your thoughts are on this like emergent church movement, how it maybe is similar or different to what we're seeing now with exvangelicals. I'm just really curious what your thoughts are on that.
No, I think that's a good point. I think that's probably true. I, in some ways, probably started deconstructing in high school, although I would not have admitted it. But
Mm,
I went through a real, and so we're talking the late 90s. Um, I went through a really difficult process of just questioning, my faith and trying to figure out how I was just really wrestling with some of these ideas and trying to figure out how I could know what was true. And I had thankfully a teacher in my Christian high school who didn't make me feel ashamed of having those questions, and
mm,
she was very devout, very conservative herself, but was there for me through those questions. And I think I think she might have been a Calvinist, so I think she probably like didn't worry too much. Like she thought I would come back or come to the right conclusion. I don't
once
know.
saved, always saved, right?
Once saved, always saved. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I'm really thankful for her presence in my life. She's passed away, but just that I had someone I could say that I was struggling, tell I was struggling and not feel like a terrible person because of it. Um, then my college, I went to evangelical college, and I had a lot of professors who really had thought hard about things, and they believed a lot of different. They had a range of beliefs, but there were people I could talk to about like the fact that look, it really looks like evolution's a thing,
Mm-hmm.
and they would be like, yeah, it kind of does. Um, and and that was again so reassuring because there's a lot of messaging when you're growing up about like not letting Satan deceive you and not
Mm-hmm.
backsliding and not being pulled away by the world. And I was trying so hard to do the right thing. I mean, I was a good Christian virgin girl. Like I was not partying. I was not sleeping around. I was not doing any of these. I wasn't having this experience because I wanted to quote unquote sin. Although, by those definitions, I've sinned plenty since then. But that was not what drove those questions. It was absolutely not. It was real intellectual grappling with
Mm,
what was true and an emotional pull toward compassion for people like my grandfather and others. Okay. So I, in many ways, I think I've had pretty fully deconstructed by my mid 20s. So we're talking mid 2000s by this point. I was aware of the emergent church. I was reading, particularly people like Rachel Held Evans, and was, inspired by her work and appreciated her work. Although I was at a little bit different place in my journey, already at that point.
Mm.
We were the same age, but for whatever reason, I was just I was a couple steps. I don't want to say ahead, but I became Episcopalian about like 10 years before she did. You know what I mean? So I was it was really cool to see someone giving such thoughtful voice to some of those things, but they were kind of things I had already done,
Mm.
and and so I didn't spend a ton of time in the emergent church period. I also had little kids then, and was in the thick of my career, and church was just a really stressful and traumatic place for me. So I was going to Episcopal services when I could, and not really finding a community there because I was so much younger than most people. There weren't a lot of people with little kids. So I was just really struggling, and I probably would have benefited from, trying to find more community around some of these things. But I think that's the difference with Exvangelical, is that finally there were places to find people. And I think in much larger numbers, there were big social media followings for certain people. There were podcasts and Facebook groups and, for goodness sake, Exvangelical influencers. And that all feels pretty that iteration of this feels pretty new and different.
Yeah.
It was a difference between reading somebody's book or maybe going to an occasional retreat versus having a constant present online community where you could find people, any time of day. I don't know. How does that fit with what you see?
Yeah. I think the other sort of big difference, again, I think there's a lot of similarities between the people that were in the emergent church movement, because a lot of them also grew up super evangelical and then had this moment in their life where they're starting to question a lot of their beliefs and everything. And certainly that was a part of the emergent church movement. So I think in that way, it's very, very similar. I think the one big difference, and maybe you have thoughts on this, that I find really interesting is the big difference between the emergent church movement and the exvangelical movement. And I've heard that there's a new emergent church podcast now that people can listen to. And one of the things that one of those folks have brought up is the big difference is that the emergent church movement was primarily interested in planting churches. These were people who were we don't necessarily agree with what we grew up with in conservative evangelicalism, and they were interested in actually forming church communities that where they could practice the faith in the way that they wanted to. Whereas obviously in the exvangelical sort of movement there's really no focus at all in planting
much more
churches.
disparate.
Right.
Yeah.
It's much more disparate in that way. So maybe you have thoughts around that, but that does seem to be maybe the biggest difference between the two, at least in my experience, is that sort of difference in church planting versus definitely not church planting in the exvangelical.
Yeah, no, and I think there are a lot of evangelicals that I've talked to that aren't primarily interested in church, right? Maybe they're open to it, but it's not they're looking for a church necessarily. They're more just trying to process what this is that we came from, and what, who do I actually want to be? It's a lot of I feel like it's a lot more figuring out. Whereas I think you're right. The emergent church movement was much more focused on okay, let's find a different kind of church. Let's find a quote unquote better church. And I think that it was somewhat successful, right? I mean, there were some churches that came out of it, but it's tricky, because I think one thing I worry about with the decline of religion in America is that, I think a lot of people are very lonely in this country, and a lot of people are looking for meaning and looking for community, and churches have provided a lot of that.
Yeah.
Now, they didn't provide it to everybody. There were people that were excluded, and sometimes the conditions for being included were very, very high and, limiting. But, there's this tension, I think, between that desire for freedom and questioning and understanding. And then at a certain point, the way you have communities and organizations and institutions is to unite around something. So, how do you give up how do you, not throw out the baby with the bathwater? To use a really tired metaphor, but I think it's a good one for this. And I don't have the answer to that. It's something I myself still struggle with, because, like I said, the closest thing I found to a spiritual home after leaving evangelicalism was the Episcopal Church, but it never provided many rich things. But I did not find in the churches that I went to the kind of close community that I had hoped I would find. I found I found teaching, I found worship, I found liturgy and things that I really appreciated, but I didn't make a lot of friends my age. I didn't find other
Mm,
moms of young kids, and I think that might be less true now. But it's a challenge for sure.
mhm, mhm. One of the words that you kind of threw out just a bit ago was exvangelical influencer, and that also seems to be something that kind of has boiled up now in the last few years, with this becoming kind of a what seems to be a really legitimate movement. Can you talk a little bit more about like what you mean by that? Because for those even inside the exvangelical world, that does seem to be like a concern. Is we've got influencers now, and there's good and bad to that. And I'm curious, like, how would you think of what is an exvangelical influencer? What do they do? What sort of, and maybe you heard thoughts around that as you were interviewing people for this book about being an exvangelical and knowing that there's kind of this like influencer pattern that has developed in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think of people like Abraham Piper, right, son of John Piper, who has a huge following on TikTok, and
Mhm.
not all of his videos are about being an exvangelical, but a lot of them are. Um, there are people like Promise Enlow, who's Eve was framed on several social media platforms, and a bunch of
Right.
others. And I think you know the internet, as we all know, has democratized information and allowed lots of people in lots of categories of life to have platforms that they never would have had otherwise. And that is good and bad, right? it,
Hmm.
it means one thing it's meant is that there are a lot of female voices that we're hearing now, in the sort of evangelical, post-evangelical, evangelical adjacent space that never would have had a platform in their churches by design. So, people like Jen Hatmaker or even Beth Moore had to leave to really have the platform that she wanted. People like Glennon Doyle, and people have a range of views about those people, but I'm just citing them
Hmm.
as, examples of female voices that have amassed really large followings, that like in a traditional evangelical church would not be able to
Right.
be in leadership. Maybe some strains of sort of Pentecostalism that allow that are a little friendlier to female clergy, but most of evangelicalism still isn't. Most mega
Right.
churches are pastored by men. Um, so and I mentioned this in because those are well, some of them are kind of influencers. You could call them that. But I mentioned this because again, this is now possible because of the internet in a way it wasn't even in the days of the emergent church. The internet
Right.
existed, but social media wasn't where it is today.
Yeah.
It wasn't as easy to make your own podcast or to have your own YouTube channel. I mean, some people were doing it, but it was a newer thing.
Right.
So I think that all factors in, but it also means that there's a huge range, right? And so and probably evangelical same peril that evangelicalism is, which is like these are big squishy terms that include a lot of people, and one person does something stupid and everybody else looks bad potentially,
Right.
and I mean, I think it's fair when evangelicals say like we're not all the same. There's nuance within the movement. It's a huge group of people. Like, don't blame me for what this one bad pastor did, and I get that. Like not everyone is the same. And so this is part of why I like being a journalist, because generally, like, I get to stop at describing things and sort of analyzing them and naming them. And I don't have to tell you, like, okay, well, this is what we do with it, because
Right.
that's where you get into trouble, right? Like,
Right.
it's like, well, how do you translate this energy into something else? And then how do you decide who's in and who's out? And what do you want to associate yourself with and not associate yourself with? And I've, within people who would describe themselves as ex-evangelical or exvangelical or post-evangelical, there have certainly been sort of intramural fights about various issues, as there are in any group. And I wouldn't expect that to be any different. But
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I think there are, look, I think groups of people, organizations of people, whatever they may be, whether they're religious or ideological or partisan, um, they're all made up of people. And people are susceptible to, uh, I think, to groupthink. They're susceptible to infighting. They're susceptible to tribalism, to dividing into smaller groups and then, warring sometimes literally with one another. And all of that, you know, I don't know how we deal with that, but I think just because the exvangelical movement is a critique of the evangelical movement doesn't mean it itself is going to be perfect.
Yeah.
Certainly not.
Yeah, one of the concerns I've heard maybe most often of sort of the exvangelical influencers, and maybe people would consider me one of these people, I don't know. But one of the concerns is, in evangelicalism, it's very, very common for like a very attractive white guy to just get on a stage and then within a few years, all of a sudden now he's got this massive following where thousands and thousands of people want to listen to his sermons. And he has done nothing in terms of qualifications to do that other than be basically groomed into that leadership position and be attractive with his smoking hot wife. Um, that really is the only qualification for a lot of those people. And then you
Mhm.
get now with the sort of exvangelical movement, you all of a sudden get people who are starting to make money, whether it's like coaching or whatever it might be, uh, based on literally just talking about how they've left evangelicalism and they're crafty enough to figure out how to get thousands and upon thousands of followers just by doing that. And it's like, all right, well, now you're starting to make money. You're making a living from doing this thing that, what have you done in terms of qualifying other than you have this story? And I've heard that as sort of one of the concerns of exvangelical influencers is you're sort of just replicating the very kind of system that you're trying to leave.
Oh, I think it's a very fair concern. I mean, I absolutely. And
Yeah.
I did not write the book to say that everybody should follow evangelical influencers, although
Right.
I'm happy that they listen to your podcast and others. But I think it's something that is important to be aware of for sure. And I didn't talk about that so much in the book, but I definitely talked about the tendency, and this is something Nadia Bolz-Weber has written about. I think I quoted her in the book, talking about the tendency to sort of leave one team and join another,
Mm,
just to find, one group to be not the group you want to be in. So just join another team and let them think for you and let them sort of call the shots for you and define who you are. And I would hope that people who consider themselves exvangelical would think beyond that too. But this is the challenge, right? I mean, people have asked me more than once if this is a coalescing, organized movement pointing in one direction or another, and I don't think it. Well, I think there are commonalities. I don't think there's like a clear mission
correct. Yeah.
other than to sort of be like a critique inside the house, which does, I think, have value. Um, but yeah, I mean, as I said before, I think the same humans have the same pitfalls that all humans have,
Hmm.
whatever they call themselves, whatever group they're in.
Yeah. I would like to talk a little bit about kind of what maybe you think about the future of exvangelicals. One of the things that has become very clear to me as I've talked to thousands upon thousands of ex-evangelical people is how much the fact that we are even exvangelical was predicated on the fact that we had a very distinct evangelical identity.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a distinct culture of, you go to youth group on Wednesdays or Sunday nights or whatever. There's a whole like there's all this kind of Christian music that you listen to. You go to Liberty University or one of your other like conservative Christian colleges. You get married at 20 or 21 or right after you graduate college. Like there's just this whole culture that being an evangelical in the 90s and 2000s was like. And one of the things that has, and maybe it's just because I've been so separated from evangelicalism now for the last 10 years or more, but it doesn't seem to me there is as distinct of a youth group culture as there was in the 90s and 2000s. Like, you know, back when we were kids or youth group kids, we didn't listen to Blink 182, we listened to Reliant K. And what I'm curious about is like, what is that? Like, is there a version of that now for youth group kids? Like, I know that youth groups are
I don't
still going
know. I
on,
mean,
right? But like,
yeah,
what is that youth group culture still like? Like clearly the purity culture stuff that we grew up with is, there isn't a new Joshua Harris that I'm aware of, but maybe there is somebody that's big on TikTok. I don't know. But it just does seem like there's maybe less institutional infrastructure within evangelicalism that has like pushed this very distinct culture within youth group culture. And if that is the case, if that has faded away in the last 10 years, then there will be millions and millions of these people who grew up in youth group in the 2010s, 2020s that don't have that distinct youth group culture identity. And therefore, I'm kind of curious, like, does that mean that there'll be less of this sort of exvangelical? It doesn't mean that they won't leave evangelicalism, but there's sort of this distinct identity of, I grew up in this very insular culture. Doesn't seem to be really maybe the case if you grew up in the 2010s or 2020s, where there seems to be less of a distinct youth group culture. So, but maybe you think that there is a very distinct youth group culture. But I'm just curious, kind of what your thoughts are, maybe on that future of what the exvangelical world could maybe look like in 10 to 15 years.
I don't know if they're in the same way, because I'm older than you and I've been out of it even longer. But I think, I mean, what is different, I mean, I'm raising teenagers, and what is different is they're all growing up, whether we like it or not, with smartphones and the internet. And so they socialize. I mean, whether they're religious or not, evangelical or not, they socialize differently than you or I did.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know how that affects youth group culture, but I imagine it must have some impact. And I think the fact that that's how they socialize, that's how they communicate. They hang out and talk they play their video games, and they talk to each other for hours while they're doing that. I try to limit it, but it happens. And same, with, they all have their group text threads and their Snapchat channels or whatever. Gosh, I'm going to sound so old. My kids would cringe so hard if they heard me say this, but you know what I'm saying? They do the things on the phones, and it's just, I think it's a really different dynamic. And also it's just not possible to be, the world is just, it's just not possible to be raised in such an insular way as I was, and you probably were. Now, I guess if you're homeschooled in a family that has no devices and that does not let kids get on the internet, or that has a nanny, a net nanny, it's probably possible to replicate it to a large extent. But the second that they get out into the real world, it's going to be so much easier to find all the information. I mean, that's a lot of what I think happened to millennial exvangelicals, is that if you were raised in a bubble to one extent or another, as soon as you come of age, you've got a whole world of information at your fingertips. And that democratization of information that we were just talking about. And that's even more true for people who are coming up now. So I don't know what it means for the future, but I think one thing that's pretty clear is our country is becoming more polarized. And, looking at the data on white evangelicals, they're even more solidly Republican than they were in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what does that mean for the next generation? I have no idea. I don't know if it means they double down or if they backlash harder. I don't know.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's really interesting to think through of, again, I think there will continue to be millions and millions of people who will leave evangelicalism. People who are, even when Trump was in office, they were elementary school kids or whatever. And I think those people will continue to leave evangelicalism. But yeah, this sort of distinct this sort of, my whole Twitter is predicated on the fact that you had a distinct youth group culture experience, right?
Mm-hmm,
And I just don't know what that looks like for the average youth group kid right now. There's no more Acquire the Fire. There's no more Cornerstone to go to. There's not a Joshua Harris I Kiss Dating Goodbye.
Right.
So it's just really interesting.
I think the closest thing,
maybe all that stuff exists on TikTok, but or maybe that same messaging still exists on TikTok. But again, I feel very unaware, and it definitely does seem like those institutions that were so important in evangelicalism in the 90s and 2000s, they no longer exist. And what does that mean then for the experience of the average youth group kid now? I don't know.
I mean, the closest thing might be some of these online conservative political channels that are geared toward younger people. I don't know.
Yeah. So anyway, it is really interesting to think through the fact that so much of the identity of being an exvangelical was predicated on the fact that you had this very distinct youth group culture experience. And if that experience is so drastically different now, it's really
and consider the context in which we were growing up too. You were born in the 90s?
94, yeah.
Yeah, and I was born in 81. And so basically right around the time you were born, so around the time I was in middle school, was the first peak of white evangelicalism. It was almost 1 in 4 people at that time. And then there was a little dip, and then it came back up again in the mid 2000s, and then just plummeted, along with we're talking about religious decline across the board too. It's not just
Right.
evangelicals. It's Christianity. It's white Christianity especially. But evangelicalism is, uniquely influential in our politics and uniquely kind of cohesive as a subculture. So at the time that I was, a youngster, a middle schooler, and you were a baby, we were part of this massive subculture. It's shrunk considerably, and the country has gotten much less religious across the board. So I think, again, I don't know the answer to how it shapes people, but I think that's got to shape the next generation in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. Last couple of questions here, Sarah. I think about this question a lot, but I'd love to hear kind of your thought on this. But what's one thing, especially again, as you've encountered all these exvangelical stories, what's one thing you wish evangelicals would know or maybe even accept about exvangelicals?
Oh, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the fact that, this pushback that I write about and that I think we've both have heard that people deconstruct because they want to sin, because they want to be rebellious. I just think it's really unfair and really unkind. Of course, when people deconstruct, they'll probably change their behavior. If you believe differently and you're sticking to really strict rules, you probably will change some of your behavior. If you're a strict vegan and you come to feel that eating animals is okay, you probably will eat bacon sometimes, right? It's the same kind of thing. Like, it doesn't mean that you hate animals all of a sudden. It just means your views have changed. And, could somebody change their views to accommodate their desires? Sure. But in my own experience, as I was describing and in what I've encountered talking to other people, I really don't think that is what's normally going on. And so, we all have the capacity for self-deception. So maybe, but I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I only know my own heart, but I think, I remember the agony I felt when I started to have doubts about these things. And it was not at all instigated by wanting to, go sleep around. I was 14 years old and was terrified of that. No one wanted to sleep with me anyway. So, anyway, so I hope that I wish that evangelicals, and I think some get that, but I think too many don't, and that they would be more understanding of that, and at least willing to sort of engage with the questions and the pain that a lot of exvangelicals are expressing, because I think that drives a lot of it too.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the things I constantly hear is that we exvangelicals were never true Christians, and I'm like, you think I would have just willingly listened to Reliant K and not Blink 182 if I was never a real Christian? If I grew up an atheist, like, nobody grows up an atheist and is like, yeah, I'm not going to listen to Blink 182. I'm going to listen to Reliant K instead. Like, of course I was a freaking true Christian. Like. So anyway,
and that's the reason that I think that there's so much agonizing about it, because it's like you've held these beliefs very dearly and they've meant something to you, but you have to sort of figure out how much of that was a product of something you were told by other people and how much of it was real and what's the real part, and how do you like move forward as a whole human being?
Yeah. You don't deconstruct something that you didn't sincerely construct in the first place.
Right.
So last couple of questions here, Sarah. How do you hope this book inspires and liberates its readers?
Well, already I'm hearing from a lot of people. For a while there, I was getting messages just about every day, sometimes multiple messages, and I'm still getting quite a few from people who've said, thank you, some version of, thank you for writing this. This is really my story. Several people have said, I don't know how you captured so exactly what we experienced, but I think it's because it was a very, like you say, there was the subculture. There was a very common sort of youth group experience that so many of us went through, and leaving it has, well, the particulars are somewhat different. The feelings are very, very similar. And so I hope that will continue, that people will feel, validated by it. I've also heard from people who don't have any real connection to evangelical culture, but want to understand it better because it is so influential. They know people who are evangelical. They feel frustrated by the influence of evangelical politics on the country. And I have heard from several folks who say, reading the book really kind of helped me get it finally. And I appreciate that too, very much.
That's great. Last question here, Sarah. How can listeners get connected to you and your work, and where would you encourage them to buy the book?
I always encourage buying it at indie bookstores if you can, but it's available in all the usual places. It is called The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. You can find me on Instagram, Sarah McCammon _journalist, or my Substack, which is free. Sarah McCammon. It's called Off the Air, a journalist after hours thoughts. So
That's great. I love that title of your Substack. I didn't realize that.
yeah, thanks. It's some of it's about like things that happen on the campaign trail, stuff about book travel, random stuff about my kids. I wrote about making kombucha once. I failed. I didn't write about that part though. I probably should have for full accountability. But
Yeah, that's
anyway,
right.
yeah,
You need better accountability buddies.
that's right. Accountability partner.
Right.
Have you made your kombucha? No, it turned out,
Wonderful.
it turned out really badly. So I had to trash it. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Love it. Love it. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for chatting more about the book. I just think it's so important. I mean, again, it really captures my experience. Obviously, it captures a lot of your experience, and so many of the people that care about our work, they'll find so much. There's so many stories in there where it's like, oh my God, I'm not like the only one that went through that too. So that is just so and so important, I think, for a lot of people. So thank you so much for chatting more about it.
Yeah. Thanks so much for talking. Good to talk to you always.